Hi, y'all are. I'm glad for you to see me today, I guarantee. This is Paul Hood, the Cajun Counselor, with another episode of my podcast, The Cajun Counselor. Laissez le bon temps rouler. Hi, y'all are. I'm glad for you to see me today, I guarantee. Paul Hood, the Cajun Counselor, here with another episode of my podcast, The Cajun Counselor. And today, I am in a 1978 Houston Astros St. Patrick's Day spring training jersey that was J.R. Richards, one of the great pitchers of Astros, who suffered a stroke, unfortunately. It really hurt us, obviously hurt him, but hurt us a lot. But the reason why I am in St. Patty's Day sort of attire is because this episode is going to be the last one that comes out before St. Patrick's Day. And those of you who watch know that a couple episodes ago, I went through a book named The Last Caprice by Robert Mencken, where I read strange will bequests. This is my favorite one, and I may have even mentioned it in that podcast. But I used to read this bequest to my estate and gift tax students at University of New Orleans in the spring. I always taught in the spring around St. Patrick's Day. And it is a bequest of the annual sum of 10 pounds by an 18th century English gentleman to be used for the following purpose. So he's basically creating an annuity that will pay 10 pounds annually. Here is the purpose. It is my will and pleasure that this sum shall be spent in the purchase of a certain quantity of the liquor vulgarly called whiskey. And it shall be publicly given out that a certain number of persons, Irish only, not to exceed 20, who may choose to assemble in the cemetery in which I shall be interred on the anniversary of my death, shall have the same distributed to them. Further, it is my desire that each shall consume it by half a pint, till the whole is consumed, each being likewise provided with a stout oaken stick and a knife, and that they shall drink it all on the spot. Knowing what I know of the Irish character, my conviction is that with these materials given, they will not fail to destroy each other. And when in the course of time the race comes to be exterminated, this neighborhood at least may, perhaps, be colonized by civilized and respected Englishmen. Ouch. But always funny. All right, keeping things moving here. One of the things that, and I got into a discussion on LinkedIn about this, which is really what triggered it and made it grist for this podcast mill. And it is something that one of my mentors, the late, great Jerry Levan, who left us in 2012, with I know a lot more to say than he actually had time to say. Jerry used to talk about a concept called the keep or sell meeting. And when I edited, or at least reviewed, most of his books in various forms. And for a long time, it was a self-published book entitled The 39 Questions That Family Businesses Need to Answer. Eventually, he got it published by Routledge, and I have the book. It's not named, it doesn't have the same name. A lot of times in families, the advisors who tend to side with those who are in charge set up these sort of family meetings. And of course, if they can get away with it, they just put the current heads of the business or the family or the business family or the family business in charge of this meeting, which is a bad idea. I'm always fond of the phrase, culture eats structure for breakfast. Culture eats structure for breakfast. And it truly does. To me, and Jerry agreed with this, putting any family either in a blessing situation or at the titular head of the table has too much hierarchy in it already. Even if, I don't care how many disclaimers, reminders you give, it just doesn't matter, okay? It doesn't matter. And I learned how to do these meetings, and I've done them over the years, and I tweak, my rules. I mean, Jerry's been dead now for coming on, 14 years. And I still miss he and Sarah, his late wife, who survived him. But here are my rules for what I would call the keep or sell meeting. First, a non-family member runs the meeting. Number two, all family members by blood or adoption down to age 8 are invited. Now, one thing that would come up periodically is, what about stepchildren? If stepchildren are included in family events, they're included in this family keep or sell meeting. Having been in a number of Roman Catholic parishes where they have what's called a youth mass, or if it's like the main mass and the kids who haven't received First Communion yet, they'll all go up front and Father will talk to them, and then they'll leave before the offertory, the second part of the Mass, the Eucharist and the offertory and that thing. So I would gather, and I do, gather them up front. And what it is a great visual, because the family gets to see its future in a room. And a lot of people, a lot of adults, and I would say that I'm a rare exception. I love listening to kids because I have been floored by what they have to say. So I will actually listen to most adults talk at kids, and they really don't care what the kid wants to or has to say. And I'm exactly the opposite. And I remember 2 different family meetings where I think one of the kids was 9, and I want to say the other one was maybe like 11 or 12. But they made really important comments, and they were both, they weren't just, can't we all get along? I mean, none of this real simple stuff. They were actually substantive business thoughts that the family was like, that's a great idea. And it was inspirational not only for the adults to see what their youngsters are capable of, because they are capable of quite a bit. Humans have been doing this now for 250,000 years in the current form. So it's a pretty big deal. I like the kids there, and I like all the family sitting together. I love the kids up front. I talk to them, and then they go back and take their seats, but they stay in the meeting. Third rule, I make it clear that this is a sense of the family meeting. It's not binding over anybody in the room who has the legal authority, responsibility, and or control. But I remind them that this is a safe space, and there is to be no repercussions. And I tell them that resist mightily any urge at retribution. So, because I promise you, it will end up being the opening of Pandora's box, proverbial Pandora's box in your family. I've always enjoyed the keep or sell meeting myself because this is a safe place to talk. Should we sell? Because it's perceived to be disloyal in a lot of families to think about working somewhere else or thinking about selling our business. So it's a big deal. I like them because the family can get re-energized. Maybe it's been on inertia for a while, and now they're got an idea for a new product, a new division, a potential acquisition, a potential sale. But it gets people together. What about in outlaws? Well, I always believed that you needed to cast a wide net. And you need those in-laws, outlaws in the room. And as you could expect, I'd get pushback on that. Well, what I'd tell them is, when they complain, it's, oh, no, that's not happening. And it was always a definite, that is not happening, or something along those lines. When y'all see Aaron go baseball, not Aaron go Bry, which I guess they would say on St. Patrick's Day. Mardi Gras is coming up, and it will be over by the time this comes out, and we'll be in the throes of Lent. But what I would tell them is, the person who's married them, your family member who's married or dating them, or as their significant other, who they're sharing a bed with, they're talking to them, okay? They're either complaining or whatever, or just commenting. And that can cause real difficulties, and it can put the family member, spouse, significant other in a really tough spot. A really tough spot. So I would rather have them in the room to let them listen. You can watch them. You can observe their body language. And I also tell them, every now and then, one of those in-laws who definitely wants to be in has an idea for the business that they've been telling their partner, but the partner's never passed it on, even under their own banner. And I've seen that. And I'd say, look, you may well have a situation, especially where you have family, let's say it's a business in G3, and you've got like 5 spouses of, of family members who are in a position, they're adults, they're professionals, they are this or that. Maybe they're elected officials. I've had them be federal judges before. And so they have some wisdom that you only get to see on display at, family gatherings, holidays, stuff like that, where you don't really talk about this kind of stuff. I've always been about, and I think Jerry was this way too, about unity and alignment. It's not so much a decentralized or egalitarian type approach. It may have that effect. But that's not what motivated me and why I'm not a fan of using that word. I'm more about unity and alignment. And I think, even though I never got a chance to discuss that with Jerry, and Jerry, could be cagey, and we had sort of a father-son kind of relationship, because when I met Jerry Levan, I was a 14-year-old friend of his son from Camp Fern in Marshall, Texas. He was Mr. Levan for a long time before we became, collaborators and partners and everything else. And I mean, I loved him like a dad. I could wring his neck sometimes, but I definitely, and I'm sure he could mine as well. All right, let's move on to the days that break you are the days that make you. That's true. Been there, done that. Immutable truth, I say. Buckle up, Buttercup. Jimmy Dugan was right. There's no crying in baseball. I'm a stoic in my personal philosophy in the Marcus Aurelius Epictetus variety, and believe that there are only explanations, there are no excuses. Be transparent. Vouchsafe the sanctity and inviolable nature of your word. In other words, do what you said you were going to do. Be accountable. But that comes with, and this is what's missing today in many situations, the concomitant obligation of holding others accountable. It's one thing to be accountable ourselves, but we have to hold others accountable. Because if we don't, then everything devolves down to nothing. And it's just not going to, it's not going to work well. Set firm boundaries. Boundaries are very, very important. I have no control over what other people think or do. People are going to do what they're going to do, and God bless them, you have to let them. You know it's not a good idea. You know it's going to create major problems, but you can't help it. Apologize when you need to. In my case, I find myself there regularly. Thankfully, I'm unbridled in rendering apologies. I have no problem apologizing because I want to be with the right, and what that acknowledges is that I'm not always right. In fact, I'm not sure how good my original batting average is, but in the end, I want it to all be 100%. Because I want to be with the right, even if I have to change my mind down the road. Keep your side of the street clean. I try to do that. Move on from defeats and heartaches and heartbreaks. It's easy to stew and all that, but it's like I heard once, and this is so great. Get down off of the cross, we need the wood. After all, Jesus Christ only stayed on it one day. It's okay to find yourself in the problem, but don't tarry there, because your time is far better spent in the solution. Joe South wrote a crossover hit, Rose Garden, which several artists recorded. Lynn Anderson had a hit at number one in the country charts in both 70 and 71, and hit number 3 in the United States pop charts in 71. It was I Beg Your Pardon, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden. Along with the sunshine, there's got to be a little rain sometime. When you take, you got to give. So live and let go. I beg your pardon. I never promised you a rose garden. It's like I always say, and I love baseball. Baseball has always been my love. And Mr. Cub, Ernie Banks, the late great Ernie Banks, used to say, "It's a beautiful day. Let's play two." All right, moving on to another technical topic. One of the biggest things out there today is what are called donor-advised funds. You may see them referred to by the acronym DAF. For me, the DAF, which really came into place after the Pension Protection Act of 2006, after Katrina, but I wrote about it and all that. I wrote an article a couple years ago on the rungs of control and how it impacts a family's decision, essentially which charitable vehicle they're going to choose. Whether it's a private foundation, charitable lead trust, charitable remainder trust, charitable gift annuity. There are like 12 major charitable techniques. In families that are looking or considering between a private foundation and a donor-advised fund, there's gigantic differences between the two. And one of the biggest factors, and maybe the biggest, is the amount of money you're going to put in. To me, a private foundation isn't worth fooling with in the end. It becomes a very inefficient cost thing unless you're going to put $2 to $5 million in it. So for a gift smaller than that, a lot of times people think about a donor-advised fund. But there's one particular donor-advised fund attribute that you cannot achieve in a private foundation. It's the ability to give anonymously. Now, that's not always important to people. Not always important. But you cannot do it in a private foundation. There are too many notice requirements, and you got to keep your 990 PF public, and it shows your major donors. And if it's a private foundation, it means it's not public charity, because there's really sort of three kinds of tax charitable vehicles. You got a public that are purely charitable, not a split interest like a charitable remainder, charitable lead trust, charitable gift annuity. It's a pure just a pure way to create a charitable vehicle. And one of the problems is that the donor advised fund is built really on a fiction. And it's a fiction very similar to that of the so-called crummy rights of withdrawal that are used in insurance trusts every day. Both really only work if the plan sponsor, the DAF sponsor, or the donees in the crummy right holder do the expected thing. And what's the expected thing? The expected thing is honor the donor's advisory privilege. Because remember, in a donor advised fund, the gift is complete and the funds are irrevocably in the hands of the DAF sponsor. The donor has what are called non-binding advisory privileges, and these are really starting to play themselves out in court. I think it's the automatic feature that has become almost like a college extra point in football. They almost never miss. The NFL moved it back, and they miss a few more now, but not many. Okay? To me, the automatic feature is where the problems ultimately are, because they can compile statistics, and those statistics can either be good news or bad news, depending on how they're used. But if they're granting over 90% of the advised gifts, their marketing materials may say something like, we honor them in practice. Well, donor advised fund sponsors can either be community foundations or they can be other charities, but they tend to be, the biggest ones, tend to be either sponsored by community foundations, local community foundations, or what I call a big box DAF sponsor, like a Fidelity or a Schwab. And they have a charitable arm, but they also have an investment arm. So while they're not related legally, and I'm sure that they're all, paper-wise set up to be purely separate, but if you're dealing with the same person, if you're dealing with the same account holder, account rep, when you're dealing with either the donor advised fund or the post-tax account, that can be a real problem. So the advisory privileges, okay, we've got the donor. Well, donors don't live forever, right? Can the donor advisory privileges go on? And we're seeing this now. And to me, I can see why the big box DAF sponsors want to get more toward offering almost perpetual advisory privileges. In other words, it can be almost, and that's where they start getting into trouble, is if it starts to look like a heritable right. Why do the big box folks feel the need to do that? Well, it's because they are vulnerable to complaints that they're out-of-towners. And what happens if the advisory privileges go away, and up until then, the big box DAF sponsor had been granting to local organizations close to where the donor lives? Well, what's the incentive of a big box DAF located in Boston to continue to honor charities in Hooterville, Pixley, or Petticoat Junction? Who knows? I don't believe that Section 4966, especially its legislative history, either contemplates or permits essentially heritable advisory privileges. Another thing I see every now and then, I'm seeing less of it. I think people are finally starting to wake up to this. I don't think that 4966 permits anybody to endow a DAF as a DAF. To me, it strays into the old abuse of discretion briar patch, but without discretion, because DAF sponsors have no formal discretion as in the trust world. A trustee of a trust who has discretionary authority to distribute income and or principal has to not abuse their discretion, because a court can call them down if they do. And as I say, pigs get fat and hogs get slaughtered. I believe that only community foundations should really be allowed to sponsor donor advised funds. But I don't look for anything to change. I think the lobby on the other side in Congress is probably insurmountable, and nobody, they would squeal very loudly. So we're going to be stuck in this mode for a while. We've seen a couple of lawsuits where a DAF donor or the eventual family advisory giver or family advisor, gift advisor, have sued DAF sponsors. And one suit was just filed recently. I think you're going to have to watch out for, what does their marketing materials say? I mean, the contract that you sign for the DAF is obviously important, and that one probably has been lawyered well, and they're not making any promises about, we're going to always make your gift. In fact, there's probably some language to the contrary. But in their marketing materials, their website, their emails, I've even seen it in signature blocks of representatives from a DAF sponsor about bragging about their percentage of gifts. it's almost like an inducement. And, there are legal theories for recovery on fraud and the inducement. And I think that eventually that's probably going to happen. We're just going to have to watch it. My Tigers are off to a 4-0 start. The Astros start playing in Palm Beach Gardens. I think on the 21st, I think their first game, they play the team they share that facility with, the Washington Nationals, on the 21st. So I'm going to close with, I don't know how many of you ever watched years ago Chicago Cubs baseball on WGN. Back in the day, before Wrigley Field had lights, Harry Carey, and back then he was joined by Steve Stone, the late great Harry Carey. And Harry was a character, and he used to sing, "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," for the 7th inning stretch to the crowd. And so I'm going to close this week's episode with my impression of Harry Carey singing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" at the 7th inning stretch. All right, you nuts, let me hear you good and loud. A 1, a 2, take me out to the ball game. Take me out to the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jack. I don't care if I ever get back, and we'll root for the Cubbies. If they don't win, it's a shame. For it's 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out at the old ball game. Yeah! Harry Carey, the late great Harry Carey, bless his heart. All right, this has been Paul Hood, the Cajun Counselor, wishing you a great rest of your day, and go get 'em. Go Tigers. And that's a wrap. Hope you enjoyed this episode of the Cajun Counselor. This is Paul Hood saying, laissez le bon temps rouler. Au revoir.